In the summer of 1909, hundreds of mysterious airship sightings were reported in the British press. These Scareships, as they came to be known, would become one of the first modern media panics. It all started in March 1909, when a policeman in Peterborough saw a strange flying craft.
It had a loud engine, a powerful searchlight, and a narrow oblong shape. It flew at great speed until it disappeared into the sky.
It was an unidentified flying airship, and though there was no official response, the story soon died down. It would have remained just a local oddity had the story not fallen into the hands of London journalists a few weeks later.
Strange airships in East Anglia. Well, we'll have to send someone over there to investigate. And quickly. In every little fen village along the endless, hedgeless roads, they are looking out for the night flyer. The fact that it manoeuvres with ease so close to the North Sea has aroused apprehension, and I met many villagers who eagerly asked me for news. The mystery of the elusive airship still continues to attract attention. Obviously something has been seen and heard at night in the sky, usually at places in East Anglia, Clacton, Southend, Peterborough, Lincoln, Ipswich, to quote only a few instances.
So who, or what, was behind the sightings? Well, there were two main theories.
One explanation is that someone owns an airship and is trying it at night. It is known that there are one or two under secret construction in the country.
But there was a second and far more sinister theory. The Daily Express's Berlin correspondent reported that
German expert opinion is unanimous in believing that the airship ascends from some German warship in the North Sea, upon which it lands again after each of its flights.
There was a lot of concern at the time about German military expansion, and newspapers were filled with stories about spies, secret invasion plans, and the latest dreadnought. So there were two main theories, and each often corresponded to the political views of the newspaper. More on that later. For now, more and more sightings were being reported across the country, often stretching the limits of credulity. The London Evening News reported that it was sighted at Stamford in Lincolnshire, and then 20 minutes later at Southend-on-Sea in Essex, 70 miles away. For an airship to travel that fast, it would need to fly at over 200 miles per hour, at a time when the top speed of any airship was only 30 miles per hour. Or there was more than one airship, but that's complicating things. In Clacton-on-Sea in Essex, a local man found physical evidence of the airship. Mr. Egerton Free had seen the airship and then, as he went down to the beach, found a strange object close to where the airship had passed.
When I got to the cliff edge at the top of the steps, I saw a most curious shape sticking up in the sandy grass. It looked like a large, slightly flattened football, with a steel bar pushed right through it. The words Müller Fabrik Bremen were painted on the ball in black letters.
Was this evidence of a Zeppelin? Not quite. A few days later it was identified as a naval buoy used for target practice, and the German phrase was actually Norwegian, Müller Fabrik Drammen, with Drammen being a city in Norway. Unfortunately, by that point, stories had already been printed that there were German spies roaming the area trying to reclaim it, and more sightings were flooding in.
"12,000 words by tomorrow morning. I'll try my best."
It's in Belfast.
Coventry,
Hull.
Northampton.
It was seen from a Norwegian fishing boat, landed on Caerphilly Mountain.
It landed in London.
And I talked to the German who got out of it. Of course, in the midst of this was the politics. The more conservative newspapers took the view that these were German Zeppelins, and their ability to roam unimpeded over British skies was the fault of Liberal Prime Minister H.H. Asquith and his government.
The continuance of the present government in office involves actual and present danger to the security of these islands. Year by year, they have steadily reduced our defences. We have a depleted army, no militia, a navy scaled down, starved of men and without stores and ammunition.
By contrast, the more liberal newspapers preferred the view that the airships were top secret but innocent inventions by British tinkerers.
There is a great deal of evidence for the existence of this airship, and we are in great hopes that the owners may, after all, be Englishmen. Not of the War Office, for we have almost given up hope of airships from there, but ingenious inventors experimenting in secret, with a wonderful airship that is destined to beat all rivals.
In addition, the more liberal papers were wary of the way in which these sightings were used to justify jingoism and anti-German sentiment. The Manchester Guardian published a speech by Philip Stanhope, Liberal MP.
There seemed to be in this country a peculiar tendency for the public mind to be seized by certain spasms of panic, which swept through the country, fanned by an unscrupulous press. It seemed to be a sort of influenza.
Of course, neither theory was actually correct. It was neither German Zeppelins nor top-secret British inventions. But that didn't really matter, because what mattered was the narrative and how it could be used to attack your political opponents. Eventually, this airship mania reached a crisis point, and German authorities felt compelled to clear things up.
Suggestions that the Germans are responsible for these sights are met with contempt and ridicule.
The next day, Lord Northcliffe, the owner of the Daily Mail, published an editorial criticising those who had whipped up panic about Zeppelins. They had harmed relations with Germany and obscured the very real threat of Germany's rapid build-up of dreadnoughts. Well, if he'd only done that earlier, the next day the London Weekly Dispatch weighed in with scepticism over the whole affair.
The airship has always been sighted by night. How can a country be effectively reconnoitred in the dark, even with the aid of the fitful illumination supplied by searchlights? No airship has yet attained that perfection which would enable it to execute any sort of manoeuvre in any weather. Supposing the alleged Scareship really exists, it must have some base where it reposes during the daylight. Such a base could not possibly escape observation, especially during the tedious preliminaries to an ascent.
The airship endurance record for the time was set by LZ-4, which flew 240 miles in 12 hours in 1908. That might sound impressive, but it demonstrates that the feats described by journalists were impossible for any actually existing technology of the time. A fleet of Zeppelins would have had to have been launched from the North on Irish Sea and crawled along the country before returning to their airship carriers for refuelling, without any evidence of their existence. Credit to that particular journalist for pointing it out. Suddenly, a couple of weeks after it all started, everyone involved seemed rather embarrassed about the whole thing and collectively agreed that everyone had been rather silly for claiming to have seen airships, despite enthusiastically printing stories about them only weeks before. The Manchester Guardian printed a satirical poem on the subject.
Folk are lately much afeard of a something that appeared in the skies at dead of night, with its eyes so baleful bright. Is it what our German cousins have been turning out by dozens? Is it ours or is it their ship, this nocti volanting airship?
That's enough terrible local newspaper poetry. It's like William McGonagall. Satirical heavyweights Punch published their own cartoon, and so, only a few weeks after it all started, yesterday's airships were today's fish and chips. So, what had people seen? Part of the problem is that all of these sightings were reported in newspapers, so there's no real way of verifying them or interviewing witnesses. So many of them could have been made up by journalists. There's also evidence of hoaxes. In Northampton, the police chief arrested 2 young men who confessed to creating a large floating balloon.
We've been hearing so much about airships flying by night that I thought it were time to let Northampton see one.
Other newspapers took the view that they were advertising balloons.
Brilliant. What were they advertising?
Nobody knows, they couldn't find any. Eccentric inventors claimed that the sightings were actually their top-secret, highly advanced flying prototypes, and then failed to produce any proof of those prototypes. In Dunstable, someone went to the effort of creating the wreckage of the crashed airship, and whilst this was obviously not the remains of a real airship, many reporters were happy to use it to explain away the whole thing. Of course, my personal favourite theory is one in a letter sent to a local newspaper.
Might not the nocturnal visitor which has so disturbed many of the inhabitants of this peaceful isle be the invader from a neighbouring planet, whose advent was prophesied some time ago by one of our greatest authorities on aerial warfare?
So, what do we make of all this? Well, this is something that happens quite regularly, and each time we seem to forget the lessons we learned from it. In the years following 1909, there were a number of similar panics about mysterious airships. Even last year, a wave of drone sightings were reported across the eastern seaboard of the United States. Now, this is not the place to speculate on the origin of those drones, because a lot of that's been done already, but rather to illustrate the similarities with the 1909 sightings and the fact that, for the media, the truth behind them didn't really matter. What mattered was whether people would read about it and whether it could be used for their own political agendas. Just like in 1909, the sightings started off on the east coast before spreading inland. Some believed that they were the work of local pranksters, whilst others took it to mean something far more sinister. As the story spread, more and more people reported sightings, and demands were made that the authorities do something about it. After a couple of weeks, the story fizzled out and everyone moved on. Until next time. On the 26th of May 1909, just days after the crisis had fizzled out, LZ-5 set a new airship endurance record, flying 740 miles in 38 hours. In July, Louis Blériot became the first person to cross the English Channel in an aeroplane. In January 1915, during the First World War, the Zeppelins made their first bombing raid on Britain. Those fears, first manifest in 1909, had finally come true. This has been a story about newspapers, and it would not be possible without the hard work of Doctors Brett Coleman and David Clark, whose research has been crucial in uncovering this story. If you enjoyed this video and would like to watch more, be sure to check out our videos on the War of the Worlds, the 1938 War of the Worlds Panic, and of course, the history of British airships.